1911, Sweden. The widow who preserved her daughters in wax. The Norrland chapel discovery. The wind carried a mournful sound across the pine forests of northern Sweden. Snow fell in heavy silence, coating the land in white, as though the earth itself wanted to hide what lay beneath. Deep in the woods of Norrland, far from the warmth of towns and laughter, stood a chapel. Its doors were locked, its windows frosted over, and for years no one dared step inside. The chapel looked ordinary from the outside, just another weather-beaten structure in a land of harsh winters. But people in the village spoke of strange shadows, of a candle that burned when no one had entered, of music, faint and broken, carried on the night air. Few approached, and fewer stayed long enough to listen. It was the year 1911 when whispers grew too loud to ignore. The chapel, abandoned for seasons, was said to hold something unnatural. The villagers, wrapped in wool coats and fear, began to gather. What had once been dismissed as folklore was becoming a rumor too heavy to carry. Inside, the air was frozen still. Dust clung to every surface, yet something within defied decay. A smell lingered, sweet, chemical, cloying. Wax. And beneath that wax, flesh. At the altar, beneath a crucifix, stood two figures. Not statues, not carvings. Daughters, preserved in waxen shells, their faces eerily lifelike, their hair brushed, their dresses arranged with a mother's hand. Their skin beneath the wax had stiffened with time, but the covering gave the illusion of life. Cheeks pale and full, lips sealed as though in prayer. A widow had made this chapel her sanctuary, and inside it her prison of grief. She could not let go. She would not bury her children. Instead, she encased them in wax, preserved them in silence, and prayed before them as though heaven had relocated into her own chapel. The discovery was not gentle. It was not respectful. When authorities finally pushed open the chapel doors, lanterns flickering against the wooden walls, their boots struck frozen floorboards that creaked like bones. And when their lights reached the altar, a gasp filled the room. One officer swore he saw the girl's eyes move. Another refused to step closer. It was as if the dead themselves had been caught in mid-breath, waiting for the room to empty so they could sigh again. The widow was nowhere to be seen. Only her traces remained. A rosary worn thin, a wooden chair pulled close to the altar, and a journal, its pages pressed together with wax drippings and tears. Word spread fast. The silent chapel became a storm of voices. Some said it was witchcraft. Others claimed it was devotion carried too far. And some, quietly, admitted they understood. A mother who had lost everything, clawing against the finality of the grave. Yet even sympathy could not erase the horror. Villagers who ventured inside reported dreams afterward, of children standing by their beds, faces half flesh, half wax, whispering in the dark. The chapel became a curse, a place avoided, left to the snow and silence once again. But grief leaves fingerprints, and the widow's fingerprints were all over that chapel. Each candle melted for prayer, each brushstroke of wax across her daughter's cold skin, each hymn sung into emptiness. It was more than a discovery of bodies. It was a discovery of the lengths love could go, when love became madness. The silent chapel still stood, and with it, a question no one could answer. How long had the widow prayed beside her daughter's waxen faces before the world pried her secret open? Grief can hollow a person until they are nothing but a shadow of themselves. In the quiet towns of northern Sweden, where winter swallowed the sun and silence weighed heavy on every home, grief could become something else, something dangerous. The widow of Norrland had once been known as a kind woman. She was not wealthy, nor did she stand out in any remarkable way. She was simply a mother who lived for her daughters. But when sickness swept through the countryside, her home became a tomb. One by one the girls fell ill. Their laughter, once the heartbeat of the house, turned into coughing fits that echoed through the wooden walls. And when the fever finally broke, not with recovery, but with stillness, her world collapsed. The funeral bell rang, but the widow did not answer. Neighbors waited for the sound of shovels, for the mourning procession, for closure. None came. The girls had died, but their burial never followed. Instead, the mother disappeared into the chapel. Day after day, smoke rose from its chimney. At night, a lantern flickered against frosted glass. Some claimed they heard singing, soft and broken, as if she were lulling someone to sleep. But the girls were already asleep. Permanently, the widow could not accept that. To her, their absence was unbearable. And so, she refused to let them go. She bought wax from traveling merchants, more than any household could ever need. She gathered herbs, oils, and tools. Inside the chapel, she began her desperate work. The first layer was crude, thick, uneven. She poured melted wax over her daughters' pale faces, sealing them in a shell that gave the illusion of warmth. Their lips, frozen by death, seemed fuller once covered. Their cheeks regained a faint glow. With trembling hands, she brushed their hair, dressed them in clean gowns, and placed them upright in wooden chairs near the altar. But wax alone was not enough. Time kept gnawing at them. Each season, she worked again, touching up their faces, smoothing cracks, repairing what nature tried to reclaim. The more she worked, the more lifelike they seemed. The daughters who had been buried in silence now sat before her, eternal, preserved in layers of a mother's love and denial. The villagers whispered. They saw her less and less. When she did appear in the market, she looked ghostly. Clothes unwashed, hands raw from burns, eyes hollow as though she stared always at something no one else could see. Some pitied her. Others feared her. But no one dared confront her directly. For years she lived in this cycle: wax, prayer, silence. She spoke to her daughters as if they answered. She sang to them as though they still breathed. And she believed, perhaps truly, that so long as she tended to them, they were not gone. But grief that is left to fester does not stay quiet. It changes shape. It grows claws. It begins to own the person who carries it. By the time the chapel was opened in 1911, the widow herself had vanished. Some claimed she had wandered into the forest and never returned. Others believed she had died beside the altar, only for her body to be moved or hidden away. What remained were the daughters, her grief immortalized, standing as proof of how far love can twist a mind. Every candle she lit was still there, every hymn book worn with her touch, every chair carved with scratches from nights when she clutched the wood too tightly, begging heaven for mercy. Her daughters did not speak. They did not move. Yet their presence filled the chapel with something more suffocating than any scream. The widow's grief had not ended with death. It had stretched far beyond the grave, wrapping her children in wax, in prayer, in silence. A devotion so unyielding it became its own kind of horror. The first time the villagers saw the daughters, they thought they were statues. The candlelight played tricks, flickering across pale cheeks and glassy eyes, making them look alive. But the closer one stepped, the colder the truth became. Wax, layers of wax smoothed over dead flesh. A mother's trembling attempt to hold back decay. The figures sat near the altar, dressed in gowns of white linen, their hair brushed neatly as though awaiting a Sunday service. Their lips, sealed in silence, glistened under melted wax that caught the glow of the candles. Their faces were strangely soft, neither fully alive nor entirely dead, as if they were caught in between, trapped in the widow's desperate hands. The wax had not been perfect. Time had left its marks. One girl's cheek was cracked, revealing a darker layer beneath. Another's eyes seemed sunken, as though the wax could not stop what lay behind. Still, at a glance, they seemed to watch, to wait. Villagers who entered the chapel swore the faces changed with the light. At dusk, the wax seemed to melt further, their features blurring as if they wept. At dawn, their pale skin looked frozen, hard, unyielding. Some claimed the girls turned their heads ever so slightly. Others whispered they heard footsteps when no one moved. But the strongest horror was not in what people imagined. It was in what the widow had done, creating a shrine not of faith, but of fear. Candle stubs were scattered around their feet, melted into hardened pools on the wooden floor. Hundreds, maybe thousands, had been lit in prayer. The air reeked of wax, thick and sweet, a scent that clung to the skin and clothes of anyone who entered. It was impossible to breathe deeply inside. The chapel itself felt embalmed, preserved just as the daughters were. Each candle had been placed carefully, lined before the altar, their flames dancing in rows like mourners in procession. And above them, the faces glowed, shadows filling their hollowed eyes, light kissing the contours of their lips. The widow had not simply preserved her daughters. She had made them holy. In her grief, she gave them the aura of saints, guardians of a chapel that had long ceased to serve God. Some in the village argued this was devotion, a mother's prayer made flesh, a refusal to surrender her children to the grave. Others whispered it was blasphemy, an affront to nature and heaven alike. The authorities, when they arrived, did not know which to believe. Their lanterns lit the chapel brighter than it had been in years, casting sharp shadows across the daughters' faces. For a moment, one officer felt sure the girls would stand, their waxen hands reaching out, their lips parting to whisper the prayers their mother had once taught them. But the silence was absolute. Only the creak of floorboards and the hiss of burning candles broke it. What haunted those who saw the daughters was not the grotesque, but the intimacy. Every detail was carved from love. Every brushstroke of wax had been applied with a mother's trembling care. These were not corpses left to rot. They were children held too tightly, too lovingly, until the boundary between devotion and madness was erased. And so, the chapel was no longer a house of worship. It had become a tomb lit by candlelight, where waxen faces stared forever into the darkness. Long before the authorities stepped inside, the villagers of Norrland already knew something was wrong. They felt it in the air, heavy and strange, whenever they passed the chapel. They avoided the path that led to its door, choosing longer routes through snow-covered woods just to escape its shadow. Children dared one another to run up and touch the door at night. None ever lasted more than a few seconds. The silence of the chapel pressed against them like a living thing, and even the boldest ran back pale-faced and shaking. It was not just fear. It was gossip. Whispers in the tavern, murmurs in the market. People spoke of the widow who had gone mad with grief. Some said they heard her voice in the chapel, singing lullabies long after her daughters had died. Others swore they had seen her carrying pails of wax and herbs, her figure hunched against the snowstorm, eyes hidden under her hood. The whispers grew darker with time. One tale told of a villager who peered through the chapel window at dusk. He claimed to have seen two figures seated at the altar, their faces glowing like pale moons in candlelight. He ran home screaming, insisting the daughters were still alive, or worse, not alive at all. Another story claimed the widow herself had changed. Her skin was said to smell faintly of wax. Her fingers, burned and blistered, bore the marks of her work. Some villagers believed she had made a pact, sealing not only her children in wax but also her own soul. The church in town tried to intervene. A priest urged the widow to surrender her children to the earth, to let their bodies rest in consecrated ground. She refused. When pressed, she locked the chapel doors and did not open them again. After that, the whispers turned into fear. People stopped speaking her name aloud. They began calling her only the Widow of Norrland, as if naming her might invite her grief into their own homes. And yet, curiosity lingered. On stormy nights, when wind howled through the trees, some villagers swore they saw a faint glow from inside the chapel. Others said they heard weeping, soft and steady, carried on the snow like a hymn. No one dared to go closer, but the stories spread until the chapel was less a building and more a legend. Years passed. Children grew into adults who remembered the warnings of their parents. Never approach the chapel. Never linger near its doors. Never meet the eyes of what sat inside. But legends are like fire. They draw people closer even as they burn. By 1911, the whispers had grown so loud that silence was no longer possible. The authorities were called, lanterns in hand, to put an end to the rumors. But when the truth was revealed, it was far worse than the whispers had ever painted. The daughters were real. Their waxen faces confirmed every fear, every suspicion. The villagers had not been imagining the glow in the windows or the singing in the night. They had been witnessing devotion pushed to its breaking point, grief sculpted into flesh and wax. And once the secret was laid bare, the whispers only deepened. Now they were not about what might be inside. They were about what had been seen, what could never be unseen, and what haunted every villager long after the doors of the chapel were shut again. It was late winter when the authorities finally came. Their carriage wheels crunched over the frozen road, lanterns swinging, breath clouding the icy air. The villagers watched from their windows, curtains drawn only wide enough to glimpse the strangers who would face what none of them dared to confront. 2 officers stepped out first, their boots sinking into snow. Behind them came a priest, his black coat blending into the night. They spoke little. The silence of the village pressed too heavily, broken only by the howl of wind through pine branches. The chapel stood waiting. Its wooden door bowed from years of frost, its iron lock stiff with rust. For a moment none of them moved. The air seemed to thicken, as though the building itself resisted their approach. Finally, one officer lifted his lantern, casting a dull glow against the door, and raised a hand to knock. No answer. The second officer brought out a crowbar. With a grunt, he forced the lock, and the door groaned open. The stench struck them first. Not the usual rot of decay, but something cloying, chemical, sweet. Wax and thyme, layered so heavily it coated their throats. The priest gagged softly, crossing himself as he stepped inside. Their lanterns pushed back the darkness, revealing wooden pews covered in dust, hymnals scattered, cobwebs hanging like torn lace. The chapel looked abandoned, until their lights reached the altar. There, seated as though in eternal service, were the 2 daughters. The officers froze. One lantern nearly slipped from trembling fingers. In the flicker of light, the girls' waxen faces glowed unnaturally, their eyes dark hollows that seemed to follow movement. Their dresses were yellowed with age but carefully arranged, smoothed by hands that had tended them for years. The priest whispered a prayer, but even his voice quivered. The officers moved closer, boots creaking across the frozen floorboards. One leaned in, inspecting the figures. At first he thought them dolls, their skin too smooth, their features too deliberate. But a crack along one cheek revealed the truth. Beneath the wax was flesh, blackened, stiff, sealed away beneath years of desperate labor. The officer stumbled back, swearing under his breath. The priest lifted his lantern higher, its glow revealing more horror. Between the 2 girls sat a wooden chair, pulled close as though someone had sat vigil there for endless nights. A rosary lay draped over its armrest, beads worn thin by use. Wax drippings coated the floor, hardened into jagged shapes like frozen tears. The widow herself was gone. Only her absence lingered, heavy and accusing. They searched the chapel for signs of her coat, her belongings, any trace of where she had gone. All they found was a small journal tucked beneath the chair. Its pages were stiff, warped by melted wax, but the handwriting within was still visible. A mother's hand. A desperate hand. The priest read only a line before closing it with trembling fingers. Whatever grief lay within was too heavy to speak aloud. Outside, the villagers waited. When the officers emerged, their faces were pale, their lanterns dim. The news spread quickly. The daughters had been found, preserved in wax, their mother nowhere in sight. The chapel was sealed again. But the horror could not be locked away. The villagers would never forget the sight of the officers' faces, drained of color, their eyes hollow as though they had looked into something no man should see. And the chapel, once a place of prayer, had become something else entirely. A monument to love twisted into madness. The chapel did not just hold the daughters. It held something else, messages, fragments of sorrow etched into the very bones of the building. The officers and priest who first entered reported more than just waxen figures. They saw carvings along the pews, strange scratches etched deep into wood. Some were words, names, Bible verses written with a trembling hand. But others were symbols, Crosses drawn again and again, circles intersecting with lines, patterns repeated obsessively. It was as if the widow, trapped in her grief, had filled the silence with marks. With marks no one could ignore. The altar itself bore grooves where candles had been burned down to stubs, their wax dripping not only onto the floor but seeping into the wood, hardening into a permanent crust. In the light of lanterns, the hardened wax looked almost like veins, spreading across the altar like something alive. In the back of the chapel, near the walls, they found something stranger. Pieces of stone chipped away, exposing pale scars in the structure. Someone had scratched dates into the stone, years, months, even days, each one lined in order, as if marking the slow passage of time. Perhaps anniversaries of the daughter's deaths. Or perhaps reminders to a mother who no longer trusted her memory. One date was circled again and again, cut so deeply into stone that the marks remained visible even in the dim lantern light. No one knew what it meant. A death? Promise? Or something darker, a vow not yet fulfilled. The journal, recovered from beneath the widow's chair, hinted at her obsession. Though most of its pages were blurred with wax, certain fragments could still be read. God has taken them, but I will not. They still listen when I sing. The wax keeps them whole. The wax keeps them mine. Each line bled with grief, but also with determination. This was not mere denial, it was a mission. The widow believed she was protecting her daughters from the decay of earth, keeping them close until the day she could join them. And perhaps she did. Because among the scratches in the wood and stone, one detail chilled the villagers most. On the wall behind the altar, hidden at first by shadow, they found a single phrase carved in jagged strokes. Do not bury me. Keep me as I kept them. The meaning was clear. The widow had not only preserved her daughters. She had prepared for her own preservation, though her body was never found. Some whispered she had already completed the ritual, sealing herself away in some hidden corner. Others claimed her body had been taken by the forest, snow covering her as surely as wax had covered her children. The chapel became more than a discovery. It became a puzzle, half revelation, half unanswered question. Every mark in the wood, every chip in the stone, every drop of wax told a story of a grief so profound it had to carve itself into the world. And yet, no matter how deeply they searched, the villagers and the authorities found no final answer. Only echoes of devotion, pressed into wood and stone, whispering through time. When the story of the chapel spread beyond Norrland, people argued not only about what had been found, but about what it meant. Was the widow insane? Or was she, in her own twisted way, faithful? Some believed it was a case of madness, pure and simple. The kind of madness born from grief too deep to bear. They spoke of how her mind must have cracked when her daughters died, how reason slipped from her hands the way their last breaths had. Wax became her religion, preservation her prayer. But others, especially in the village, hesitated. They had seen the widow before her loss. She was not a wild woman. She had been kind, steady, a mother who lived for her children. Madness, they whispered, was too easy an explanation. The priest who entered the chapel left shaken, but not entirely condemning. He told the townsfolk that grief can drive a soul to strange forms of worship. That perhaps, in sealing her daughters in wax, the widow had believed she was holding them until resurrection, protecting them until God returned to claim his own. It was not madness, he suggested. It was faith stretched so far it broke. Still, there were others who argued it was not faith at all but selfishness. That the widow loved her daughters too fiercely to give them back to the earth. That she chose her need over their peace. That her love had become possession, binding them in wax not for their sake, but for her own. In the market, villagers argued in hushed voices. Some pitied her. Some cursed her. Some confessed they understood her pain too well. Because grief is not foreign. It lurks in every home that has buried a child, a parent, a sibling. And in the silence of night, who has not wished for one more day, one more glimpse, one more breath? The widow of Norrland did what others only dared imagine. She clung to her daughters so tightly that even death could not take them. Was that madness? Or was it love taken to its most extreme? The line between faith, madness, and love blurred in the cold chapel. Each candle she lit could be seen as a prayer or as obsession. Each brush of wax across pale skin could be devotion or delusion. The truth was perhaps all of it at once. Love that refused to surrender. Faith that demanded proof. Madness born from a heart too broken to mend. And in that chapel, all three lived together, glowing faintly in candlelight, staring back from waxen faces that seemed to ask the same unanswerable question. When does love become madness? And when does madness simply become love? When the officers pried open the chapel, they expected to find only silence and decay. Instead, tucked beneath the widow's chair, they found a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, stiffened by years of wax dripping over it like frozen tears. Some pages were fused together, unreadable, but enough remained to reveal the widow's voice, fragile, trembling, and consumed by grief. The earliest entries spoke of sickness. Short lines, written in haste, as though her hand shook with fear. Fever came to the youngest today. She coughs blood into her hand. I prayed all night, but heaven stayed silent. Then, weeks later, the inevitable. Both gone. The house is hollow. From there, her handwriting changed. Words grew larger, erratic, pressed so hard into the page they nearly tore through the parchment. I cannot bury them. The earth is cruel. The worms will not take them from me. God does not answer, but the wax does. The wax holds them. By the following year, the journal was less a record of events and more a ritual of obsession. She wrote prayers not to God, but to her daughters. She described smoothing wax over their skin, brushing their hair, singing them to sleep. Each entry was a conversation with children who no longer spoke back. Today you smiled at me. I know you did. The light caught your cheek just right. You are not gone. You are here. The most chilling pages were the last. Dates filled the margins, marking anniversaries of their deaths. But her words shifted from grief into something like instruction. The wax keeps you whole. It can keep me whole too. When my breath leaves me, do not bury me. Keep me as I kept you. The officers stopped reading aloud at that line. But villagers who later whispered of the journal claimed there were more words, written in near-illegible scrawls. The forest calls. If I go, I will return in silence. Look for me where the snow does not melt. No one ever found her body. The journal was sealed away as evidence, but fragments of it spread through the village like smoke. Parents warned their children not to speak of it. Yet at night, fireside conversations always circled back to the widow's words. Some felt pity, believing her writings showed nothing but a mother's broken heart. Others believed the journal was proof of her pact with something unholy, that she had traded reason for the false comfort of wax. But all agreed on one thing: her grief had become immortal. Ink on the page, wax on the skin, silence in the chapel. The journal was not just her confession. It was her curse. A testament left behind to remind the living how dangerous love can become when it refuses to let go. In 1911, the discovery of the waxen daughters drew more than just priests and police. It drew doctors, scholars, and curious men of science from Stockholm and beyond. They came with notebooks and instruments, determined to explain what had happened in that frozen chapel. Some carried scalpels, others magnifying glasses, prepared to peel back the layers of wax and uncover the truth beneath. To them, this was not a haunting. It was preservation, a grotesque form of embalming carried out by untrained hands. One physician noted that the wax had seeped into the pores of the girl's skin, hardening their features, slowing decay. A crude mummification, he wrote. Another suggested the cold climate of Norrland had aided the process, keeping the bodies from fully rotting. Science, they believed, had the answers. But when the villagers heard these explanations, they shook their heads. To them, it was not just science. It was something else, something darker. For while the scholars examined the wax, the villagers remembered the sounds. The singing in the night, the glow in the windows long after the widow had disappeared. They whispered that the daughters were not merely preserved, but held between worlds, wax as the prison, the mother's grief as the chain. Science spoke of temperature, of chemistry. Faith spoke of sin, of devotion. The villagers spoke of ghosts. And in the flicker of candlelight, even the doctors admitted unease. The faces of the daughters, though stiff, seemed to change when the lanterns moved. Their eyes caught the light in ways no corpse should. Their lips, sealed by wax, looked ready to part. More than one scholar refused to stay the night inside the chapel. A debate followed, echoing far beyond the village. Some newspapers framed the story as a medical curiosity, a glimpse into the extremes of human mourning. Others painted it as a scandal, proof of religious mania in the frozen north. And a few dared to call it what the villagers had always believed: a haunting. The clash between science and superstition only deepened the mystery. No matter how many formulas were written, no matter how many theories proposed, none could explain the feeling of dread that lingered in the chapel. Because facts could measure wax and bone, but they could not measure grief. They could not weigh the silence that pressed on the chest, or the way shadows seemed to move in that frozen room. The widow's work sat at the crossroads of both worlds. To the rational mind, it was preservation. To the grieving heart, it was devotion. To those who felt the cold air inside the chapel, it was something supernatural. An unfinished story, a spirit that refused to rest. And so, even after the scientists left, their journals full of theories, the chapel did not lose its power. If anything, it grew stronger. For every rational word written about the wax, 10 whispers rose in the village about what truly lingered there. And perhaps both were true. Perhaps science had explained the bodies but not the presence. Because no amount of reason could erase the feeling that, in that silent chapel, the daughters still listened. After 1911, the chapel was sealed. The daughters remained inside, their waxen faces locked away from curious eyes. Yet the story did not end. It echoed through Norrland, through Sweden, through time. Travelers who passed the village claimed the air grew colder when they neared the chapel. Hunters swore they saw candlelight flicker behind its frozen windows, though no hand had entered in years. Some said they heard the faint sound of singing, a lullaby carried on the wind. Always the same, always from the direction of the chapel. The villagers themselves kept their distance. Paths near the chapel grew over with snow and brush, untouched by human feet. Children were warned never to wander near it, told that the waxen daughters would watch from the windows and call them inside. Still, curiosity never died. Historians wrote of the widow's grief, calling it a rare case of mourning beyond reason. Psychologists later used it as an example of obsession, love twisted by loss. Even ghost hunters, decades later, came seeking proof of the supernatural. Some claimed they found it. Photographs taken through broken slats of the chapel showed strange streaks of light, shapes that looked like figures kneeling before the altar. Recordings captured faint whispers, indecipherable but haunting. None of it was proven. All of it was believed. The widow herself became more myth than woman. Some said she wandered into the forests and froze beneath the snow, her body never found. Others believed she had joined her daughters, entombed somewhere within the chapel walls, her wish fulfilled in secret. A few whispered something darker, that she had never truly died at all, but lingered, her spirit tied to the waxen forms she had created. The truth was never uncovered. The silence of the chapel held it close, just as it held the daughters. Even now, more than a century later, the Norrland Chapel is remembered as a place where love defied death, and became something else. A reminder that grief can create its own monuments, carved not in stone, but in wax and silence. The widow's story asks a question that still haunts Sweden. How far would you go to keep the ones you love from leaving you? Would you let them rest? Or would you hold them, no matter the cost, until your love became the very thing that chained them to this world? The echo of that question lingers still, in the snow, in the trees, in the silent chapel where waxen faces wait forever in candlelight.